Normally, this lecture series, which we've been running since 2011, a lot of really great speakers, including the one tonight, is sponsored by the Houston Spaceport. And I don't know if you were watching Houston Spaceport on the TV a little bit earlier, but Intuitive Machines is one of the companies just successfully landed on the moon. So, it landed, it sent a signal back. We've got a week to see if the instruments are working, if we can get them on the moon, and we can get some of that data and the camera footage and stuff. But for us, essentially a startup that has been growing in Houston, coming out of Houston and growing in Houston, it's quite an amazing feat. It's the first, for those who don't know, it's the first American spacecraft on the surface of the moon since 1972. Most of you remember what that one was called. And it's the first ever commercial lander to go to the surface of another body in the solar system. So lots of really interesting things, Jim. A lot of interesting things that will help NASA continue their efforts to get to the moon and have a sustainable presence. Brings in commercial companies like, again, we're going to be hearing about the kind of some different aspects of the commercial space world and how companies are coming to try and solve some of the major challenges, some small, some big, some small becoming big. We're going to be touching on a little bit of that tonight. So really a lot of good things happening here in Houston. And we're the space peeps, right? So it's great to have you here, and hopefully we'll see you again. We're hoping, I'm still waiting for word that our next talk will be March 7. That'll be the Director of Strategic Initiatives from Johnson Space Center, if I can ever get his peeps to talk to our peeps. And then we definitely on March 21st, we're going to have a talk, another eclipse talks, but this one is about the eclipse in 1919. And for those of you who don't know, that's how we tested general relativity, Einstein's theory. And so we're going to hear about that story from a professor at Rice. On April 2nd, there's a bioscientist who wrote a book about cities on Mars, so she's going to come and talk about that work on April 2nd. And then, if we're lucky, April 18th, we're going to have a member of the Axiom 3 crew come and give a talk. He's going to be in a lot of demand. He promised me he would come. We'll see. We'll see if that works in April, but that's what we're trying for. So hopefully we'll see you again. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. Keep your eye on the news. Moon to Mars Festival at Space Center Houston is during spring break. That should be a lot of fun. And I could keep talking because there's a lot of space stuff going on because we live in Houston and I kind of like space. But let me get to our speaker tonight. So I've met Joe a couple of times. He wouldn't like me saying this, but he referred to me, I think, effectively called me Shrek. Because he called me, because of my height, he called me a giant. And then he made some joke about my accent, which of course happens to be the same as the fake accent that Shrek had. And so while he was introducing me to it, because he was running a panel, I went, oh, yes, I was going to say something bad. That gentleman just called me Shrek. So I'm not going to refer to him by any names like that. But he's a great guy to get to know. Lots of really interesting ideas. Lots of things happening, and he'll tell you a lot about the things he's doing. But let me introduce him to you first. So Joe is a retired Army colonel with 22 years of space operations experience, and he wants to make a dent in the space debris population. Doesn't matter what kind of talk we have, people always ask about space debris, so I thought it was really important to bring Joe out here. Raised in Northwest Houston during the space shuttle era, he always had space on his mind and eventually found himself supporting the shuttle and the International Space Station as an Army Space Operations Officer. It was then that he learned about the resources required for conjunction assessment and collision avoidance. I hope you're going to explain that to everybody.
Absolutely.
Flash forward 20 years, and there are no signs that this problem is going away, which is certainly true. And so Joe has decided to take a swing at the solution with his company that he's going to tell us about his activities there. So please join me in welcoming Joe Guzman.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Is everything working?
Share your screen.
Screen share? I'm not going to do slides quite yet, but they can see me. Okay, we're good. Fantastic. It's great to be back in my hometown of Houston. Space City, original Space City, the OG Space City. And here at Rice, where I came, many times I was up here at Herman Park or the zoo on on field trips, or even last week I was at Johnson Space Center for the big party for Intuitive Machines, and congratulations again to the team there. Tremendous accomplishment landing on the moon. Just literally about an hour and a half ago or something like that. It's amazing that commercial companies today are doing things that, not too long ago, only the greatest and most powerful nations on the face of the earth were capable of doing, and now we're doing it with small businesses, which is really been an inspiration for me to get into the space business after having served in the defense space industry for so long. Flashing back to my very first duty, actually I guess it was my second duty station as a space ops officer. I was stationed at Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center back in the early 2000s, and at that time we did space operations from NORAD, if you're familiar with NORAD. So NORAD mission still goes on out there in Colorado Springs, but the space mission was actually taken out and sent out to California, where they do operations now out of Vandenberg Space Force Base. But back in the day, old Captain Guzman then, I was about, I guess, 10 years into my Army career at the time, was trained as an orbital analyst at Schriever Air Force Base, Colorado Springs, and made my way back to Cheyenne Mountains to really start working on console and doing orbital mechanics and orbital analysis for U.S. Strategic Command. So U.S. Strategic Command is kind of well known for being the nuclear command and control, strategic deterrent lead command for the Defense Department. During 9/11, the old aftermath of 9/11, 9/11 Commission, what used to be Space Command was actually stood down, and they brought Northern Command into existence, which is really responsible for the protection of the homeland from a military perspective. And so because Space Command was pushed to the side, remember the old Star Wars program, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, kind of went the way of the dinosaur, and along with it, the command, Space Command went. The space mission went over to Strategic Command. So I was working for Strategic Command doing space operations for DoD, and my job was to help keep our nation's most sensitive satellites, intel community satellites, missile warning satellites, and things that were instrumental to our strategic deterrence mission. Our job was to keep those things safe, and we did that by a host of different jobs that we did. One of those things was called conjunction assessment, and at the time, I remember during my training, I actually cataloged, I think, object number 23,323 or something like that. It was the last DSP satellite that was launched. DSP is a missile warning satellite, so it detects missiles being launched. And I actually got to catalog that satellite. So back then we had 23,000 cataloged objects. Today that's up into the 55,000 or so, something like that. But our job was to take what we knew about our national satellites and run those known orbits against the orbits of all the known debris that were also in orbit. And we used a big sensor network called the Space Surveillance Network to actually track these objects in space. All those observations would pile into our ops center, and then we used these programs, computer programs, pretty high speed at the time, but by today's standards, not so much. But we used those computers to essentially do predictions of where two objects in space might collide or conjunct. And that's called conjunction assessment. And then we ran back then a few, 2 or 3 runs per day, all objects versus all objects. And so we would identify all of the conjunctions that were happening in space. And then we'd filter out, when we saw that our national, the ones that my unit was tasked with protecting, when our birds were in harm's way, and we'd number one, let everybody know, the NRO, the operators in what would be eventually the Space Force, but that back then the Air Force space units, kind of tell everybody what was going on, that there was a conjunction that's going to be happening in the future. And then our job was to direct the sensor network to actually collect more data about the two objects that were colliding or that were expected to collide. And then by collecting more data, then we could tighten up the orbital predictions, and then we'd get the days would pass and we'd get closer and closer to the time of closest approach, or TCA is what we used to call it. And over that course of that week or so, we'd either see it continue to be a threat, or we'd see the threat dissipate, where we got more information, we could see that this collision wasn't going to happen. And so that would inform our decision on what would happen. But we did this job also for human spaceflight. So at the time, the shuttle was returning to flight after the Columbia disaster. So we were supporting the shuttle return to flight program. We were still building the ISS. We were supporting NASA with conjunction assessment for the ISS. And of course, NASA has liaison there with the space unit. So we can do that more effectively, as does the NRO, which was kind of our job. And so if there was going to be a conjunction, or the conjunction was still going to happen, then we'd be on the horn with the NRO Operations Center, and we essentially went back and forth like that until they either maneuvered the satellite or they decided to what we called assume risk, or if the risk went away. So there's really only two options. You could just kind of wait and see what happens. That was option number one. And option number two was to move the satellite. And back then, and really this is still the case today, satellites were built with the amount of fuel that they expected to use in their lifetime. And so there was a limit to how much they could maneuver. And so whenever there was a decision to maneuver a satellite, it was a very, very intense decision, because that essentially shortened the life of the satellite itself. And so they didn't take those decisions lightly. We're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of satellite here. So and by the way, they were essentially national security assets. They're some of the nation's greatest tools in protecting our country. So big decisions, and so those were never taken lightly. And also the risk threshold for conducting collision avoidance maneuvers was pretty way up there. I mean, they would maneuver a satellite if there was a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 chance. So that was enough. If you can kind of do the risk calculation in your head, 1 in 10,000, and the satellite is worth a couple billion, I mean, it's worth it to move the satellite, right? Oh, by the way, you have the nation's security on the line as well. So even that very slight chance, they went ahead and made the decisions to move these assets. In the case of ISS with NASA, you got humans on there, and nobody wants anything bad to happen to our astronauts or cosmonauts or our allies that were joining us up there on the station, and still do to this day. And so maneuvering the ISS is also a very big endeavor. Because of the human aspect, and such highly trained individuals, and really they're some of our nations and the nations that they come from, our allies and partners, best and brightest people. They take millions and millions and millions of dollars to train astronauts. They're people that we have to protect. And oh, by the way, they are humans, and we want to do everything we can to protect them, especially since they're doing so much to protect us. The station is pretty large. It's 400,000 kilos, I believe. I looked it up. It's pretty gigantic. I had the opportunity to interview a gentleman who had been an operations, ISS operations guy on the floor there as a attitude control officer, and he helped me understand how much it actually took to move the station, and it's pretty crazy. But 7 kilograms of propellant to move that thing, and each kilogram costs roughly, I'd estimate about $50,000 per kilogram. So just in propellant alone, you're burning close to $500,000 every time you have to move not to mention, that takes away from maneuver that you could do otherwise. And the good thing is that the station can be refueled, so not cheaply, but so another aspect of the station is when it has to conduct a maneuver, the astronauts can't really do their missions, and so had the opportunity to actually talk to one of the current astronauts, Mark Van Hey, also a retired colonel, Army colonel. And Mark was on board the station when they had to maneuver, or I'm sorry, not maneuver, but shelter in place because of debris that was shed from a Russian anti-satellite missile test that happened in late November 2021, just before the Ukraine invasion. And he shared with me that they basically couldn't do anything for a period of time. Let's call it 5 days or so. And if I started thinking about, well, man, I wonder how much that cost. You lost all this mission time, especially now that we're going towards commercial space stations with your Lockheed Martins, your Sierra Space, Axiom, et cetera. They're going to be essentially paying commercial astronauts to do business, to do jobs in space. And so I asked Mark, I wonder how much that costs. And he said, you know what, I think they actually did an estimation. So I went back after our talk, and I looked it up. In Axiom, there was some literature out there that astronaut time is worth $130,000 per hour, and so when you're talking about 5 astronauts for 24 hours times 5 days, you start approaching the $100 million cost of doing business in space with respect to debris. And so what I started piecing together was this idea way back in 2004, and this, of course, I was just brand new in space, so all the stuff that I just told you, I hadn't experienced that or known that yet. But in my mind, I'm just thinking, man, we're spending a lot of time on this space debris stuff, and there's a lot of it, and but I understood how important it was for us to do that mission. So 20 years later, I was actually retiring now from the Army, and I had a long career in space operations. I was in the Pentagon at the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration. I was there for the whole excitement about the Space Force was starting to generate. I was actually serving on the Army staff, so my day job, I had to really wear a straight face and be against the Space Force, because that was the Army's position at the time, because of resource battles and whatnot. But there was a lot of resistance. I mean, in reality, there was a lot of resistance from the existing services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, because, of course, if another service comes to the table, now they have to split the pie 5 ways instead of 4. And it really went against, it made it harder for them to do their mission. So there was a lot of pushback against the Space Force. And so the space operator inside of me was like all for it, but the Army officer that was serving on the Army staff had to kind of like be the, poke holes in the idea. But thankfully, and I think it was a really, really important move, and it was we were unfortunately behind the Chinese, both the Chinese and the Russians, in establishing a space command or a space force. But we were able to do both in that roughly 2-3 year time frame. And by the time I was retiring from the Army in August of 2020, we'd actually stood up Space Command, reestablished Space Command, now out in Colorado Springs. I was a member of the Space Command as we stood up and got to conduct space operations in support of the nuclear mission at Strategic Command. So I got to see a lot of really neat things come full circle for the space mission. And I left the Army thinking that, number one, I didn't want to work for anybody else. I had really kind of had it up to here with the corporate structure type kind of thing. Being in the military so long, I really kind of wanted to let my, just do whatever I wanted. I wanted to have some freedom. And so I decided I was going to be a small business owner and started a space consultancy literally the day I retired from the Army, I was already working for another space company, a foreign space company actually, in helping them market space propulsion equipment here in the States. But that helped me to get out there and start networking, kind of building my network. I was at the time based in Omaha, Nebraska. Did a little bit of traveling, that the little that you could post-COVID, and kind of picking up the pieces after that. A few space, like the Space Symposium, I think was the first thing that came back, and we were all in masks, but at least we were doing business again. And it was fun to start meeting new people out in the now commercial area. And a lot of my colleagues that I'd worked for or worked with during my career in the Defense Department were out and about. So I started running into more and more people. And a lot of them were getting into small businesses or supporting small business. And I don't know, I got the bug. I was like, I think I want to try too. I think I can do this. I thought I had enough experience in defense space that I might be able to offer something. And so I started looking at small business opportunities for space, and responding to some cyber ones and some space ones here and there, and kind of just getting myself together as a company to be able to do business with the government. Took me a while to learn, but was able to get through that with a lot of help. Veterans organizations, the services. There's quite a few organizations out there to help folks get on their feet to do this kind of thing, which I was super grateful for. And bottom line, I finally won one of these SBIRs. I got his phase one, and the topic was space debris. And remembering way back to my the beginnings of my space career back in Cheyenne Mountain, I really thought I had something to share with respect to space debris. And so I started looking into what we could do to combat the threat and the risk associated with space debris. Now, a lot different situation in 2021, 2022 with respect to space debris. Now, we're starting to learn that there's not just 23,000 objects like we had back in 2004, okay? In the catalog, we're tracking about 45,000 objects now. Of that 45,000, about 35,000 of those are debris items. Another caveat on what we can track, the limitations on size of what we can track with the Space Surveillance Network is limited to about 10 centimeters and above. So anything smaller than 10 centimeters, we can't really see, or at least we're not telling anybody we can see that. And it's not shared with the general public, if it's indeed possible. So bottom line is there's a lot of debris out there. I didn't really know how much there was. There was a lot of estimates. The folks at NASA, who I even worked with back in 2003 and 4, they had some estimates, as many as 500,000 pieces of small debris. And then we started getting a little bit more data trickling in, and some other actually commercial companies now doing space domain awareness, as this mission is now called. So learning more about what's in orbit, and it turns out that there are probably, and I'll use a quote from Slingshot CEO and founder Melanie Strickland last year at the Space Symposium, used the number 300 million pieces of debris in orbit. 300 million pieces of debris. Now some of them are like paint flecks, okay? But a paint fleck traveling at 17,000 miles an hour can actually do damage to a spacecraft. So there's a lot of debris out there. That's a lot of mission. And obviously, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of money to kind of turn the tide. Because what we're facing right now is a situation where even if we stop launching all spacecraft today, the population of space debris would continue to rise because there's collisions happening that we can't see, because of weapons testing, like those done by the Russians, the Chinese, the United States, the Indians. Weapons testing has created a lot of debris. There have been some notable collisions of spacecraft and debris. Kind of the most notable, I think, was the Iridium constellation, Iridium collision with a Russian rocket body. I think this was roughly the 2013 timeframe. And that was an active commercial satellite that got hit by a large piece of debris. It caused a big mess. Bottom line is that even if we stop launching satellites today, the number of debris would continue to increase. So that tells us we've got to do something about debris. And really there's 4 ways. I'll throw up a chart here. And I was fortunate to get involved with a group that had a conference out in Switzerland in 2002 that I got to attend. And it was led by a couple folks. One was ClearSpace. ClearSpace is a European company that's a leader in active debris remediation. So they're really learning a lot about how to do active debris remediation. But I first saw this chart at that conference, and it was briefed by ClearSpace. Tim McKay was the gentleman who briefed the chart. I've been kind of using this as my North Star ever since. And what this chart basically says on the side there, you have things that you can do to mitigate risk for space debris. One is you can increase impact tolerance. That means adding shielding to the spacecraft. Okay, that also adds weight, so there's a cost to it. The second thing is you can conduct collision avoidance, like I told you, how we did it. Okay, that's the second thing you can do. The third thing, so down on the environmental stewardship side, you can prevent or create less debris on purpose, which we've been guilty of ourselves. But thankfully now the United States has entered into this weapons testing moratorium where we're no longer testing space weapons that create debris. And we've gotten a lot of our allies and partners to come along with us on that. Now, our adversaries at China, the Russians, et cetera, haven't signed on to that, obviously. But we can do a lot to help ourselves. And that's what debris prevention is. There's also been some really hefty work done by NASA to kind of bring down the threshold. So whenever you're operating a satellite now, the operating guidelines are for the company that needs to dispose of that spacecraft within 5 years. It used to be 25 years. So now we've actually brought that down to 5. There's a lot of advocates out there that say that needs to be 1 year or even a month. If your thing is dead, you need to find a way to get it out of orbit and out of the way, because essentially you just got a huge mass of potential debris that you're leaving in orbit. And it just turns into this situation where you need to leave, it's kind of like the Boy Scouts, leave it better than you found it. And so we need to start really taking those actions in space. That's what debris prevention is. And then lastly, we come down to this thing called active debris remediation. And that is the task of actually going and collecting the trash, collecting the debris. That's what active debris remediation is. ADR, that's what the ADR stands for on my company, Space Cowboy ADR. So over to the little risk chart there, you can see on the millimeter scale on the far left of the graphic there, millimeter scale debris, you can reduce the risk to that by increasing your impact tolerance. So you add shielding onto your spacecraft, and it gives you decent protection against those millimeter scale debris. On the far right, if it's greater than 10 centimeters, that means the network can track it. That means we likely would know with some precision where it is, and that we can avoid collisions with it, assuming your spacecraft has some maneuverability. And so collision avoidance reduces the risk to those large pieces of debris. So that leaves this little slice between 1 centimeter and 10 centimeters, where it's below the threshold for tracking, so we have very little information on where these items are. However, it's large enough, greater than 1 centimeter, where the energy that thing is carrying actually has enough energy to destroy, or I'd say potentially damage or even destroy an active satellite. And that could be the ISS. I mean, if a piece of debris that size hit the ISS in the exact, wrong spot, so to speak, it could be catastrophic. It could kill everybody on board. Now, fairly recently, within the last couple of years, there was a piece of small debris, and it was never identified exactly what it was. It was actually attributed to a micrometeoroid, but it penetrated it penetrated the radiator on the escape spacecraft that hangs below the ISS. It's a Russian spacecraft provided by the Russians, and the radiator on that thing was actually punctured by something. I would guess it's probably one of these million pieces of small space debris, personally. But that's not what was said in the press. Of course, it was attributed to some micrometeoroid, what have you. It's a piece of debris, right? Something penetrated that thing, caused it to leak, and the escape capsule for the ISS was disabled, so there was no escape hatch. Something went wrong on the station. That escape capability was now not at their disposal. So that was a significant degrade for the ISS. And incidentally, that progress or Soyuz capsule was actually replaced with another one that suffered actually the same demise. So he was either hit by something else, or maybe there was some faulty engineering. We're not sure what happened, but the radiator leaked on that one too, and so I think that's kind of gone, worked its way through its course. But it shows that a small piece of space debris can have a really tremendous impact on ISS operations. And that tells us that out of this million, and oh, by the way, this medium sized debris between 1 and 10 centimeters, the estimated population is about 1 million in LEO, in low Earth orbit. So there's 1 million of those things that we don't know. Now remember, flashback, we're tracking 45,000 pieces of, total pieces in orbit, including all active satellites and known debris. That is only a fraction of a percent of what's up there that's actually lethal or potentially lethal to our active satellites. So the situation from a debris perspective is bad enough. Now, to add fuel onto the fire, what you have is the situation where there's a lot of great things that we can do in space. Case in point today was landing on the moon. But there's all kinds of business models and what you can do in the moon or in orbit, in LEO in particular. The microgravity environment there, makes the manufacture of particular types of things. I know of a couple in particular. One are a particular type of coolant that they think could be manufactured in microgravity, brought back down to Earth, and actually used to cool computer equipment in a particularly high efficiency fashion. That's one thing. There are human organoids that are projected to be grown in this microgravity environment, so that if someone needs a liver transplant, they can actually take that person's DNA, grow them a liver in space, and then use that tissue to do surgery. That's just the tip of the iceberg with the zero G or microgravity manufacture. Communications, obviously, solar collection in space, so power production. You could collect a lot of solar energy in space and beam that down to the Earth for use as a clean energy source. The list goes on and on. In order to enable all this stuff, there is a whole ecosystem of services that are being created. One is gas stations in space. So a company called Orbit Fab out of Colorado, fantastic CEO, Daniel Faber, kind of took me under his wing at a very early stage when I was just having initial ideas, and he encouraged me to run with it. Because from his perspective, he's got a huge gas station in space, or multiple gas stations in space, that are all vulnerable to debris. And so there's this symbiotic relationship between all this space ecosystem. There's going to be gas stations, there's going to be manufacture, there's going to be power production, et cetera. All these things are happening in space. Space tourism is another thing that needs protection. Anything that's large and hard to move is going to be needing the protection of something like what I'm imagining with Space Cowboy. And so, as I've developed this company, I'm off trying to brief investors and trying to get people to buy in. And it's very tough because this market doesn't exist yet, and that's something that investors, obviously are interested in. And so it's very early. It's my job to help develop that market so that we can, eventually operate in it. But it's going to happen. I mean, all these things are coming together. The technology exists, and so it's not really a technology issue. It's about integration. It's about doing it. I mean, we're seeing now that commercial companies can take off rockets and land them, like on a regular basis. You're seeing commercial companies on the moon. I mean, there are no limits to what these small businesses, once upon a time were small businesses, now they're giants, can do. And so, I just asked the question, why not me? Get to work, Guzman. So that's kind of where I am. But in order to create this market, there has to be a way to make money. So the question coming from the investors is always, well, who's going to pay for space debris removal? And really, the commercial people over here say, hey, the government created all the debris. They're the ones who've been launching rockets for 70 years. They're the ones that did all the testing that left clouds of debris in orbit. And then the government people over here say, yeah, but we opened the door for you. Now you have the ability to launch yourself into space. We created the environment where we could make progress on the STEM fields and the technology to enable what you're doing. And oh, by the way, you're going to make all the money, so you do it. And so what we have is this back and forth between government, commercial, kind of arguing on who's going to pay for it. And so I've put about a year's worth of thought into who's going to pay for it. And the first thing I think we have to acknowledge, and what I always try to tell people is, number one, we're already paying for it. Okay, you're paying for it because collision avoidance is expensive. You're paying for it because tracking debris is expensive. Defense Department in 2022 was appropriated roughly $800 million for space situational awareness. There was, roughly about 40,000 pieces, so that breaks down to about 18 grand per piece per year. Now, remember, we're only tracking less than 1% of all lethal debris, so that really behooves us to track as much as we can of that lethal debris. And when you start getting into the multiples, even tracking the debris is going to be a really daunting task financially. Not just, forget the technology, but just coming up with the money to track all that debris is crazy. And the debris exists now, so really it's just a matter of us applying the technology to actually see it and catalog it and track it. And you could see not an exponential, but a logarithmic increase in the number of debris that we track, which will in turn make us collision avoidance maneuver more. And the bottom line is we need another option. Collision avoidance maneuvering and tracking more debris and more debris and more debris is an unsustainable financial practice. That is straight out the get-go. Everyone will pay one way or another. They're going to pay either to sustain the environment or they're going to pay when the environment collapses. So one way or another, the space debris problem is going to force us to come with a plan. So the status quo is really, there's no question that the status quo just does not get us there. And so we look at other models, and I've taken the last year to kind of give this a lot of thought. I have two sons that are in the mining industry, and in the mining industry, I learned that before a mine is actually, before they're licensed to start operations, they actually have to put away money to recover that mine back to pre-mining, environmental conditions. So they basically have to fill in the mine if it's let's say it's an open mine. They have to take all that, all the earth that they move to get into the mineable materials, and put everything back out, plant a couple of trees and stuff like that, and then they can get out and receive their bond money back. So that's a model. And if you think of that in terms of space debris, if I'm launching a satellite you could actually, regulations could force that company to put up a bond that basically is to cover any space debris that's created by their constellation or by their satellite. And you don't get that money back until you actually deorbit or find some way to safely dispose of your satellite, either reclaim it or recycle it, or you do something with it. But it's not the status quo, which is you just leave it in orbit and let it die. I mean, that's kind of where we are right now. So that's kind of the mining industry model. Air traffic control is another thing that the government has a great role in air traffic control. The regulations, the standards are all set by the government. The individual nations actually have their own versions of air traffic control and how they fund that. So it proves that not everybody has to be on exactly the same system. The United States does it one way, Canada does another way. The nations in Europe do it a different way. China does it a different way. We all fund air traffic control in one way, or, in some way. A lot of it we fund through taxing the consumer. So when you buy a ticket to fly, you actually pay fees that go towards air traffic control in many cases. And those are because, why do you do that? Well, you have a stake in the game, right? You're flying on the aircraft. I am thankful that somebody out there is directing traffic. That costs money. I'm willing to put in my share. So I think that also proves that consumers are willing to pay for their fair share. Now, there's a lot of good that's done to the general public, like for instance, mail also goes on commercial airplanes, and my fees don't pay for the mail. Those are covered by the mail fees. So which actually come from another kind of arm of the government. So it shows that the government and commercial can actually work together inside one model, and that also that nations can work together under this kind of umbrella of air traffic control with specific standards and fund safe operations. It's a valid model, and one that we should learn from. And then lastly, the insurance model. I get a lot of feedback, especially from investors that tell me, this is an insurance play. This is definitely an insurance thing. I've actually talked to insurance folks. In fact, there's one gentleman who is pretty high up in a particular company that insures satellites. There's very few LEO satellites that are actually insured for operations today. And the reason that is because the risks they're not measurable. Like I've already said, there's 1 million pieces of lethal debris out there that we don't know where they are. If you put a price tag on that insurance policy, it's actually probably costs more than operating the satellite. So it just creates something that's not doable from a business perspective. But the more that we learn about where those satellites are operating, I think that it'll shed a lot of light on how dangerous space operations are, how much resources satellite owner-operators are dedicating to risk reduction and operating in a congested environment, and convince them that ADR is a valid option. Active debris remediation is a valid option to go to reduce that risk. And so that brings us to the unit economics. So really the value that we have to offer in order to use the power of market economics to get on top of the space debris problem, which is really what we're doing. And if you look back in the history of the world and history of the United States in particular, you'll find that we apply market economics to the biggest problems that we have. If it looks like a really insurmountable problem, you put a market economy on that, and people go to work because they make money fixing it. That's how the United States does business. And so I really believe that fixing, or at least managing, the space debris problem, really, one of our greatest tools is going to be market economics. And so making unit economics for capturing space debris is really the gold standard. That's what we have to do. We have to make it cheaper to collect debris than it is to maneuver and track. So That's the bottom line. And so those are kind of the principles that I used as we developed Space Cowboy. I'll come out of here. Next, I'm going to just play the video. So rather than try to talk you through what we do, see if we can get this thing to play. Start from the start. The little trash can there on the end of the spacecraft we call the capture and arrest mechanism. It's essentially an opening and closing trash can, and we maneuver the satellite to a close proximity with the debris by getting into a co-orbital situation. So that means that we're in the exact same orbit as the piece of debris, creating a situation where the relative velocity between the two objects is virtually zero, and then we can maneuver that last tactical mile, capture the piece of debris. So that is keeping it simple. If you guys are interested, you want to see that again, you can always go to our website, spacecowboy.today. And it's up there. You can have a look at that. But essentially, that's what we came up with. That's the idea. It's one piece at a time. And a lot of people ask, when I tell them we're doing active debris remediation, they ask me, are you using lasers? Are you using a net? Are you using this? Are you using that? And I tell them, no, we're keeping it simple. Imagine, and I tell people this story all the time. Imagine if you were to walk out of your house and your driveway, and you happen to spot a nail, like right in your driveway where you're going to be, parking your car. And what's the first thing that comes to mind? Of course, go build a laser so you can blast it, right? Or go get your fishing net and grab it with a net. No, you hit it on the head. In my simple mind, you bend over, you pick up the nail, and you put it in the garbage. And so my military career taught me one thing, that keep it simple, stupid. We called it the KISS principle. A lot of people know about the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. And also in the startup industry, I think Agile tells us to let's do an MVP first. Do it. Do something first. And instead of spending 10 years on a laser, go get a piece of debris. One piece. If you collected one piece of debris, it's worth a lot more. You would learn a lot more by doing that operation than you will by going and building this, this laser. So that's why we've chosen to take the company in this direction, with the knowledge or the forethought that this isn't how we're always going to do business. This is just how we're going to do it first. And so I'm taking the page out of entrepreneur after entrepreneur after entrepreneur, that you create something really simple first. And I just happened to be visiting one of my minor engineering sons up in Wisconsin over the holidays for Christmas. And so we went to the Harley Davidson Museum, and I just stood there and looked at the first Harley Davidson. It's basically a little, kind of like an e-bike that we have these days, but it had a little gas motor on it. So it was literally a bicycle with a motor on it. I was like, that's the first Harley Davidson. And then you go to the other end of the museum, and you see the real sexy, looking, choppers with the, just tricked out and futuristic looking Harley Davidson. That's where they are, 100 years later, or 120 years later. And so that's what I envisioned for Space Cowboy, is that, this is our little bicycle with an engine on it. In the future, someday, it might have a laser on it. It might have some kind of other collection mechanism. But the first one is just going to have a trash can on it. So that's where we are. And I wanted to actually save a little bit of time for questions, and I realized I talked forever. But we got 10 minutes or so, and would love to field a couple of questions if you have any. Let's start right here.
So
Joe, would you mind, I'm going to try and see if I can find a handheld, but if
Oh, there is a handheld somewhere.
the question for the online audience,
Sure, no, absolutely.
online audience, but I presume we have some,
I hope there's some people out there.
well, it's nice that everybody wanted to come and see you.
Hello?
I think that's for him, right?
Yeah, but, yeah, it's not working. Well, if you just, well, maybe you don't have.
I can repeat the question.
Please.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Your proposed or current business model, what happens once you capture, let's say, a fairly large size object in a place?
Right,
And what happens next? Is it
right. So the answer to that question is we go collect another one. So it's a collect and store, collect and store. We've built this thing to do a repeatable operation. And you'll notice that little can is essentially, if we're picking up smaller pieces, you can store more. If they're larger pieces, obviously it fills up faster. But we're estimating about 10 pieces per month. And with that, we can scale up the constellation to about 30. And then now you're talking 3,000 pieces per year. And so each time we do that, we collect it, we store it. Once we get a full can, we'll do one or two things. We can take the spacecraft down low and empty the canister into the atmosphere where that debris will actually burn up and re-enter into the Earth's atmosphere. That's kind of like the initial thing. Really, our vision is to recycle that material in space. So we want to keep it up there. Any debris or mass that's actually in orbit has been put up there at a cost of about $10,000 per kilogram. So every kilogram of material that you're keeping up there, you're actually saving launch costs, you're saving the resources that required to put mass in orbit, and you can actually use that material again. And so these spacecraft are made of some pretty interesting materials. There's titaniums, there's aluminum alloys, silicon dioxide. The things that you need to make solar panels obviously are up there. So there's gold, there's platinum, there's semi-precious metals, heavy metals, all part of the processors and those things. So there's a lot of valuable materials. And then I'll just kind of take it one step further. And there's a very interesting company called Think Orbital that, if you're interested in that, that is their business model, to take recycled materials from space and actually create usable materials out of that stuff. They can make wire, they can make ingots, and those can be used for in-space manufacture or even spacecraft propulsion fuel. So that's the idea. And thanks for the question.
Thank you. And we did have Lee Rosen from Think Orbital give one of our lectures. Some of you were at, but that's online if you want to go and look at what they're planning to do and do it. So we have a question here, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, right here.
Really particular orbit you're aiming for it first?
So the question is there a particular orbit we're aiming for first? And the answer to that is it really depends on the customer. So first customer gets to choose the first orbit. And but I'll say this, that the sun-sink orbit, a polar orbit, and I don't know how familiar you are with the orbits. There's different ones that are applicable, but the sun-sink orbit essentially goes from pole to pole, North Pole to South Pole. And so the Earth turns underneath that. And because of the unique properties of the sun-sink orbit, we've actually been using that thing for a long time. NASA has lots of satellites in sun-sink. The intel community, so weather satellites, et cetera, all use the sun-sink orbit. And because people have been operating there for a long time, we're guessing that there's quite a bit of debris. And I think the data backs that up. So sun-sink seems to be the logical place to go first. Oh, by the way, our refueling partners will also be in sun-sink. So right here.
You had a lot of explanation about the science and inspiration. You also talked a lot about this being a startup. How big is your startup right now?
You're looking at it. So the question was, how big is my startup? And I said, you're looking at it.
That's what I thought. So what would be your first hire?
So my first hire is really my co-founder. So right now, my co-founder, Aaron Ger, he's a fellow West Point graduate with me. He was also a long-term Army officer. He's an engineer and served with the Army Corps of Engineers. And Aaron, I'm looking, my first hire would be to bring him on full-time, because really it's his project management expertise that's really going to make Space Cowboy come alive. And so he'll be managing the ops, and I'll be the fundraising guy. And that's kind of the first thing. But we are leveraging a lot of the engineering expertise that we can get commercially available from partners that we've created in Austin and across Texas. And elsewhere also. I mean, we've got some ties to like cybersecurity folks in California and digital twin folks in Florida, and there's a lot that goes into building something like this. So we're going to be building a team of teams essentially. But the first hire is definitely going to be bringing my co-founder on full time.
Up in the back.
Up in the back. Yeah.
So I apologize if this is a bit of a dumb question, but I noticed that your Space Debris program, you need a trash can, right? And so I was wondering, would the debris be pretty fast enough to destroy the satellites, or how would you be able to, at least make the debris go slow?
Okay, so the question is, how do we put ourselves in the situation to actually capture debris when we're both going very fast?
Yeah.
So the answer to that question lies in what's called rendezvous and proximity operations. So if you've ever heard of docking, like when a spacecraft launches and goes to resupply the shuttle or bring new astronauts to the shuttle, it does what's called RPO, rendezvous proximity operations. So they essentially get their orbit to match the orbit of the station, and then that last portion you can essentially maneuver, kind of like visual, basically doing small burns to get you in the situation to actually do the docking procedure. So this is basically instead of Dragon to ISS, this is Space Cowboy to Space Debris. And so we do the same thing, rendezvous and proximity operations, and then maneuver on the satellite. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so Oog, and then Dave should.
Oog.
I want to come back to the active debris rover.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that, given the current, do you think that it is economically affordable with the current technology? Because that will require your spacecraft to go back and forth.
That's right. So the question is the economic viability, essentially the unit economics of Space Cowboy. Now, to the best of my ability, I've created a financial model to go along with this thing. So, and I made a lot of assumptions, as every entrepreneur does, but based on the model that I've created and a lot of assumptions in terms of how much it costs to refuel, which I actually have collaborated on. I've got actual quotes from Orbit Fab on the cost of refueling this thing every month for a year. The cost of doing ground station support, the cost of crew, the cost of actually building the satellites themselves, which we're estimating to be about $8 million a copy. We think that one satellite can operate for about 5 years and do enough collections over that time frame to pay for herself and actually make a profit. So $70,000 is kind of like the going in cost that we're modeling right now. And at $70,000 per piece, that's essentially what we're doing. And so the question is, at $70,000, is it cheaper to maneuver the satellite or cheaper to do the ADR? And then this goes into a little bit more modeling, because collecting the piece of debris to protect our customer is one transaction, but removing that debris from the environment also has follow-on benefits. So no one ever has to track that piece of debris again. It's gone from the picture. And no one ever has to conduct another collision avoidance maneuver again against that particular piece of debris. And so those we're considering a net positive for us as well. And we think that those are benefits of ADR that extend to beyond the customer to the rest of the general population, and that those costs should be incentivized by some kind of government tax incentive, like some kind of a tax write-off or a tax credit for the cost of ADR, and that offsets the government's future cost of tracking that particular piece of debris. So everybody wins in that. It incentivizes people to commercially execute ADR, and it also does a good thing for the government as well. So I think that also offsets the costs that a future company would pay for ADR and makes it more of an economic positive for them. Basically boosts operating margin is what you're doing at that point.
So I have a question so are you planning to collect medium-sized debris? Is that what you said? And if so, I remember you mentioning that it's hard to track medium-sized debris. So how would you know when to open it?
Right. Okay, so the question is, are we going to track or are we going to collect medium-sized debris? The answer is yes. We understand that it is hard to track. In some cases, very difficult to track. So when I said that, it's kind of like a little bit misleading. So when you're tracking, what tracking means is that you've identified it, you know where it came from, and you can predict where it's going to be in the future. So the criteria of actually tracking something is pretty difficult to do, even for a large piece of space debris. What we can do, I think, is we can apply the technologies that we already have to identify clouds of debris. So maybe not individual pieces, but we can actually see where large clusters of debris are, for instance. And so Space Cowboy's job is to approach that cluster from the rear of the cluster, and then identify individual pieces within that cluster and start to pick them off one at a time. So it's almost like a scouting operation or some kind of, we send somebody to where we think there's a debris cloud and start to see it, number one, catalog it, take data, and also remove as many as we can, and remove the ones that are most dangerous to our customers.
There's a question down here and then back, and we're bouncing around. It's good there's so many questions. Yes.
My original question was just about that, but then from your answer just now, what I'm curious about is if you're targeting clusters, doesn't that mean your object would be susceptible to collision from those other debris that you find around?
That's a great point. Yep, absolutely. Our spacecraft will have to have some kind of protections, and so it'll be heavily shielded. But I think the most important thing that we can do is be cognizant of where we're going. If we're collecting in a cluster, I mentioned the RPO type kind of thing. If we're in roughly the same orbit as that cluster, then our relative velocity with respect to that cluster is going to be fairly low. And so if we were to collide with a small piece of debris, but we're both going the same direction, we would anticipate that damage to be minimal. The pieces that you really have to look out for are the ones that are coming in from the sides and from the front, because those would carry the most relative velocity with respect to your spacecraft. And so, absolutely something that we have to learn how to do, and learning how to operate in those environments is going to be a campaign. So it might come down to this, like an operation where we understand that we have to reduce this cloud before we can get to this cloud, if that makes sense. So to get over those kind of hurdles, the plan is to really leverage the hell out of AI to create trajectories for our spacecraft that are, number one, safe, and number two, enable us to collect as much debris as possible, and use the least amount of resources. So all those factors going into that AI and machine learning piece. So that's a large part of the spacecraft.
Okay, we have a question up here, then we'll
I love all the questions. I'll keep them coming.
So we'll get one question up here. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so if you're targeting debris that's a customer's requested that you collect, but along the way you notice, stage left, there's something, do you divert and collect it and just kind of be like the Hoover? Or are you just working where?
I think in that case, if we had an opportunity, a target of opportunity like that, I think the number one thing we do is collect data on it, especially if it's something that no one's seen before, which is something that I think I'm anticipating that's going to happen a lot. We're going to see lots of things no one's seen before, but not necessarily top of our priority list. But what we can do is collect some data on it and share the orbital location of that piece, have it cataloged so that we can come back to it at a later time if it's a threat. And that may even be a step right there, is get some data, see how threatening it is, and that might make the case for us to actually maneuver to that one. But or bring in another asset. So we're planning on operating at initially 30, a constellation of 30 satellites. So we could have multiple satellites in one orbit. Ideally, we would have at least pairs to operate together. So yeah, I think that's something that will be worked out with as we mature the concept.
So I'm going to take the liberty of standing up here and having a little bit of control. So with that question, though, I mean, if there was a model where basically, let's say governments got together and said, we really need to solve this problem, and a company like Space Cowboy goes up, and you're heading for this piece of debris, but as you say, you see, if you can collect, you get paid for how many pieces of debris you pick up in a month rather than, a specific customer's target. Mm-hmm. Is that a model where then it's like you are kind of, I mean, you have to be efficient with fuel, but that's where you can basically, you don't care.
Right.
Somebody says, I want this. Or
like if there's a general contract for what I was.
There's a model out there for people who clean up Superfund sites or whatever.
It's very interesting. I was listening to a podcast on the way up, and they were talking about the difference between hygiene and something else. But essentially, hygiene is that general cleanliness of the environment. So going up to do a hygiene mission would be, hey, if you see it, collect it, kind of for the general good, right? And then a medication would be specific, more specific for a specific customer and a specific threat. In other words, like excising a specific, tumor, so to speak, in the medical profession. So, yeah, there's going to be hygiene missions, and then there's going to be surgical strike, so to speak.
Let's mention manufacturing human tissue on a zero environment. Let's say I'm building a factory to have this project on. I would definitely like to hire you, not to say it because it's too risky an investment, so I want you to protect me. Do you have already traction from customers when you discuss your project?
Yeah, so the question is, do I have any traction with potential customers? And the answer to that is I have one on paper. And so we've actually talked to Space Force. So again, going back to the beginning of the story here, they're the ones who kind of like said, go find ways to mitigate risk. Well, we actually approached the Space Force Satellite Systems Command based in LA, and with the Space Cowboy concept, and asked them to be our customer, and they said actually yes. They signed on the dotted line and said that they would certainly consider our services if we brought them to the market, of course. And then we also got backing from the operational arm of the Space Force, which is the Space Operations Command, who also signed on as an end user. So they would be the operational arm who would actually essentially tell me which pieces to pick up. And so in principle, yeah, I've got a degree of traction, at least interest, from the Space Force, and that's kind of step one. I think NASA is probably the second step, followed by several American commercial space station companies like Lockheed Martin. I'm looking at Axios and also Sierra Space. Yeah.
Liza, did you have a question? And I'll come over here and then we'll finish.
Yeah, I have a couple online questions.
Oh, sweet. Online questions.
Oh, we didn't have anybody online. Great, thank you. So can you tell us who it is?
Yeah, so from Brandon Sanchez, they asked how often are you all planning to collect the debris? Also, would there be an effect in the ozone/climate? This is a great topic to further do research into.
Absolutely. And Brandon, thanks for the question. Question is, how many can we do, right? Essentially?
How often?
How often, yeah. So we're modeling about one collect per 3 days or so. So about 100 per year per satellite. And that's essentially, which essentially kind of calculates out to about 10 a month. And we've we've also kind of figured in about 1 refuel per month as well in our model. So that's kind of how it works out. Sir?
First thing, thank you for serving in the military for us.
Absolutely.
The question I had you thought about, I worked in a restaurant, and at the end of my shift, the crew came in and cleaned up. And they would clean up everything. Have you thought about going to satellite manufacturers and saying, hey, because you do it over and over, you can develop a system and say, I will give you, at the end of your satellite's life, or whatever they're doing, I will take care of them and they pay you. And since you do it over and over, you're duplicating that, you could do it at a lower cost. And then my second question is, have you thought about a giant magnet? If you send it through a debris field or something, you go through and it collects everything and then you just deorbit it. Because using a trash can, it's use mechanisms, you got to orient it, you've got things that can fail.
Right.
Others.
So the first question is, have we talked to satellite manufacturers about coming in once the end of their satellite, once their satellites have reached the end of life, and do some kind of reclaiming of their satellite? Is that right?
Yeah, actually developing the software or whatever needs to be attached to it with this line, or integrated in, and you do it. You kind of do that as a patent. You just do it over and over.
So you're talking about putting our payload as a hosted payload on somebody else's satellite?
Yeah.
We've thought of that. Yeah, actually, we have thought of that. That's something. I'm open to discussions about hosting our payload on other platforms, where like anybody could pick up a piece of trash, which would be really cool. I mean, I think that obviously, one thing that we're trying to do, not what Space Cowboy, but the industry in general, is to put more sensors on spacecraft. Anyways, right now, as we stand right now, most spacecraft are flying blind, so they're not able to sense what's going on around them. Now, just like we've gone to with automobiles, just in recent history, they now have LiDAR and radar on them, so that it detects the vehicles that are around you and will tell you if you're cutting somebody off and things like that. So putting those kind of sensors on spacecraft is something that's definitely being developed right now by other companies to collect data on stuff that's out there in your surroundings. So I think that it's definitely something that's in the realm of the possibility. And then the second question was, the magnetic. We've thought about it. It's not a bad idea. In fact, there's a company that kind of came out of Texas A&M called FluxWorks, and FluxWorks deals in magnets. So I've talked to their CEO a lot, and one of the things that we think that is probably the first step is to, instead of using gears and moving parts on our spacecraft, is to use their electromagnetics to do the movements. And so it requires less moving parts, less friction, and less potential failures on the spacecraft. So yes, the magnets is a big deal, sir.
Let me just barge in this very, very quickly. Almost there's very little ferrous metal in any satellite. Satellites are the mass is very critical. They're almost made out of like titanium, aluminum.
Right.
Magnets have very little utility to collect debris like this.
Yeah, and I was going to say that's one of the challenges. The other thing is to have an electromagnet takes a lot of power as well, so you have to then act on that too. So we're almost up, so I'm going to give Jim his question, and Linda, you can finish. Oh, and Jim, one online, Linda, you get the last question. Okay, very a good one. So what?
Can I get it for the last one then?
Yours, get the third up. The last one, we get the third up.
I'll try to be brief with my answers.
This is a question posed to Sir David and to you, Colonel Guzman. First, thank you for your service, Colonel.
Absolutely.
I've been thinking about the rings of Saturn and the other rings around our planets, and what we're talking about is a debris field, and aren't these debris fields subject to the laws of physics? And are there rings of this debris out there that over the course of your 20 years, your group has discerned? And the follow-up is, when you succeed, and you are going to succeed, when you move move into the hygiene collection, would these rings of debris be low-hanging fruit to collect?
I think that definitely, so the question is, are there rings of debris? And based on what I've seen from data, I wouldn't call them rings. They're more like donuts.
Right?
But there are orbit regimes
Yes.
that have more debris in them than others. And that's just because of where we actually put satellites. I mean, a lot of people are unaware of that there are particular orbits that have higher value because of they're essentially engineered so that you can do particular missions. A very good case for that is the geobelt. So about 36,000 kilometers away from the equator, there's a belt of satellites. It runs all the way around the Earth. The reason that is because those satellites have a period, that's the amount of time it takes them to go around the Earth, of 24 hours. So as the Earth turns, that satellite stays right over top of the Earth. And so that geobelt is packed. It's like a traffic jam in the geobelt. And everybody's going 17,000 miles around, and they're going around the same, in the same direction. So there's quite a bit of debris in that geobelt, and there's other companies that are going to the geobelt to police that area. And so I'd say, yeah, there are. And the geobelt is more like a ring, a big ring, just like you said. So well
The comment I would make is that depending on how you define debris, right? There are individual pieces, an astronaut's glove, there's a dead satellite that was in a specific orbit. But there was a couple of anti-satellite tests that created clouds of debris. In orbital mechanics, we've all seen Sandra Bullock change orbits with a fire extinguisher. And so these things, they tend to be clustered.
Right.
But depending what their initial velocity was from the impact, that's how they spread and they get into their orbit. And then over time, that's adjusted because of the orbit that they're in, but they're also affected by solar radiation, which also affects them.
And the magnetosphere
We're underneath that. But the other thing is, even the solar activity isn't just light shining on the place. The atmosphere increases drag in all the orbits. So it's a whole bunch of complicated processes that allow it to spread out. Over long enough time, you might have a ring of debris in that specific orbit, but that's going to take a long, long time.
That's your hygiene market right there, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Eliza, there's one online. Linda, I'm hoping. No, you get scared. All right, so we have the last question. Chickened out on me. We have the last question from online, please, Eliza.
From David Perla, you mentioned possibly recycling the space debris. With the satellite dock with other stations to deposit the debris, what is a possible process for recycling?
Yeah, so the question was, and thanks David Perla for sending in the question, but what would the process be for offloading the recyclable materials? And that's exactly what we would do, is maneuver to a recycle point or a third party where that recycle is going to take place, and essentially offload the materials with our same capture and arrest mechanism, but instead of pushing the debris into the atmosphere, we'd actually just be pushing it into a different canister. Think of it like a recycle collection point in space. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.
So again, I'm going to stop there. This guy has to drive back to Austin, and I do have to feed him before. So again, you can see it's a very, very important problem. It's going to need a solution. It's going to need answers. It's going to need companies coming along and providing those solutions. And so, I hate to say this, but watch this space. There's a lot. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for those online.
Thanks, everybody. You can check us out too on. Check us out online, spacecowboy.today, and follow us on LinkedIn. That's where I put out most of my business stuff. Space Cowboy ADR on LinkedIn, or me, Joe Guzman, on LinkedIn, and would love to exchange notes or answer questions. If anybody has them, just send them my way on LinkedIn. So, thank you very much for coming. I had a great time.
For helping us out.
Eliza, thank you. Lauren, appreciate it. And David, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
You know what I say?